to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Eric Levitz. He's a political writer for New York Magazine's Intelligencer. Eric, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Eric, you have a new piece out. Unions are not a special interest group, and you go over recent research on how unions are really essential for all the things that I think, those of us who sort of pay some attention to these things already have a sense of, raising wages, improving benefits, job security, and also that they have a disproportionate benefit for people of color and for women. But I really like the frame of that because there is this incredible false equivalency of talking about labor action as being analogous to, corporate special interests or other narrow areas. Can you explain why you would not consider unions to be a special interest group?
Yeah, sure. So basically, individual unions can at times be a special interest group in the sense that they have interests that are, conflicting with the general public to the broader good. Mm-hmm. So, a police union that is trying to protect its members from accountability when they shoot criminal suspects or just any random African American. That's obviously a situation where the union is against the general public, and similarly, more sympathetically with coal miners who are trying to defend their industry that fundamentally needs to go, or to, shrink massively quickly. They are in tension. But organized labor as an institution more broadly, and the reforms that it wants, which apply to all unions, in that capacity, they are not a special interest group because we have reams and reams of research to suggest that their interests ultimately are the average ordinary worker's interest, whether that worker is in a union or not. We now have lots of research demonstrating that, the private sector unionization rate in the United States negatively correlates with inequality and positively correlates with labor's share of productivity, that when the private sector unionization rate is high, wages are higher for workers, whether they are unionized or not. And then, another wrinkle on this that this new study was able to really put some light on was there was kind of this idea that unions, while they were, good for workers who were in them, that workers who most benefited from unions tended to be higher skilled and tended to be more white. And so it was kind of shifting. What unions were really doing was redistributing wealth among workers, and actually in a regressive way from more vulnerable workers to less vulnerable workers. And the study blows that up, one, by demonstrating that it was lifting wages for all workers, but secondly, by showing that when unions were at their peak, actually they were disproportionately African American and disproportionately low skilled. And the benefits that they provided to African Americans were greater than whites. Unions fundamentally work as a way of insulating individual workers from abuse by their employers. And because African Americans in the mid-century United States were so vulnerable to abuse by their employers, the wage premium that they enjoyed when they had a union was larger than for any other group.
You also there's also myth busting here on higher unionization rate did not correlate with slower economic growth under any of the models that researchers applied.
Yeah. I mean, is it possible theoretically that under some circumstances that unions may have a slight negative effect on growth? That, maybe, but growth matters to the extent that the gains of growth are going to ordinary people and not just collecting in Jeff Bezos' bank account. And so it is pretty clear that if there is a negative effect on growth, it is not substantial enough to offset the gains in equity that unions have produced.
I mean, as I say, I think research like this is obviously very important. It confirms a lot of what you probably would know if you were attuned to a couple of basic sort of historical or policy questions and awareness of, just some sort of very basic facts about power, about the economy, about how things like everything from a minimum wage to the weekend to the elimination of child labor were, achieved. They weren't magically bestowed by, generous corporate sector. They were earned through, literal assertion of power in the labor sector. But, unions seem like it's one of those areas where the mythology is so deep around them and the fight against them has taken so many fronts since the sort of backlash starting in the 70s and obviously accelerated and deepened from the 80s through the present on everything from, state attacks on public sector unions to the, devastation of private sector unions across the country. And there still seems to be a lot of sort of public propaganda that, the union isn't the one that ensured that we don't live in sort of like a, I don't know, Blade Runner society or whatever, and we kind of do, but that it's really like, oh, those are the guys who stand on the road and, collect money for no-show jobs, and then like, insert mafia joke here. So how important do you think is this research with like the kind of broader just sort of communications war? Because so much of the attack on unions is like a combination of raw power moving against unions and just like incessant and relentless propaganda.
Yeah, I think that unions, the public perception of them and the perception of them within the Democratic Party has really shifted in recent years. Fundamentally, to the extent that there was any kind of popular backlash against unions, it was rooted in the experience of the 70s, where you had unions who had contracts where their wages were tied to increases in inflation. So workers who were in unions were insulated from inflation, and workers who were outside of it, arguably the union contracts were driving up prices even worse for them. And so there was actually some basis for resenting unions in that peculiar economic circumstance. Mm-hmm. In today's circumstances, where you have massive inequality that is hurting all workers and unions are virtually powerless, there's no real case to be made that unions should not be aided, or that the average worker does not have anything that the average worker is being disadvantaged by unions, and that the average worker would not benefit from their expansion. And so you see, with every leading Democratic candidate endorsing very aggressive labor law reforms. So there is an ideological turn. The question is, the fundamental problem for labor has been, to a large extent, the U.S. Senate, the fact that labor did not expand into the South. It did not get too far into the West in terms of the private sector. And so you have a lot of senators, Democratic senators, even if you get rid of the filibuster, I have only 51 votes, you have a lot of senators who come from states that don't have a strong labor movement, but every single business in that state that they're accountable to does not want progressive labor law. And so there's no interest to counterbalance, like all of the businesses that want them. Every industry doesn't want this, and you have no labor movement countering that, and that is why labor law reform keeps dying in the Senate under multiple Democratic administrations now. It's so in the party's long-term interest, so in the nation's interest, that you would hope you could just elect a senator who does the right thing regardless of the internal pressures. But this is a problem that they've had previously, and I don't know whether or not it's going to take a lot of activism in organizing to overcome that problem should Democrats take back power.
Well, I'm wondering on two different threads here. And on one hand, adding further pressure, obviously, are things like the Janus case that's coming, recent, rulings by the Supreme Court that have been, even more significant structural attacks on labor. But then on the other hand, and obviously we've talked about and celebrated, the teacher strikes, and they are happening in red states. Does that potentially start, actually both of those things in different ways potentially start to change that political calculus, you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope so. I think that the teacher strikes, I see that as most immediately, really challenging the GOP's fiscal regime on the state level, where you've got this somewhat untenable situation where the average Republican voter fundamentally does not support the fiscal priorities of the people that they elect. And so long as, the cultural resentments and the partisan identification is so strong in a lot of these red states, that doesn't, so long as, nobody within the party makes that a problem, it's not a problem. But you're starting to see with these teacher strikes, there's some, self-identified conservative teachers out in these picket lines. In Kentucky, last week or the week before, you had a GOP primary where a protege of Mitch McConnell, who is the House Majority Leader in Kentucky, lost a primary to a teacher who was, making the incumbent support for pension cuts and education cuts a major issue in the campaign. So I see some promise in terms of reforming the politics of these red states, and maybe that carries over into support for unions more broadly. But we'll have to see.